Who is this person who was honored by the Congress of the United States of America? She must have done something wonderful, something that greatly improved the lives of people, something that could give us all hope.
Sister Dorothy was an American Catholic nun with the Order of Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur. She was originally from Ohio, but had moved to Brazil nearly 40 years ago with 4 other Sisters of Notre Dame in response to a request from then Pope John XXIII, who asked religious communities around the world to serve in Latin America. She worked in earnest to profess the order's mission to educate and stand with the poor. Sister Dorothy also worked with the Pastoral Land Commission, an organization of the Catholic Church that fights for the rights of rural workers and peasants. Sister Dorothy's selfless way of life brought comfort and hope to an area of the world wrought with corruption and despair. She was committed to social justice and worked tirelessly to help poor farmers with sustainable development techniques, minister and teach the men of the village to be faith leaders, and help in the building of houses and schoolrooms. Sister Dorothy taught the women of Brazil to sew and to sell clothing, to finance the building of a dam, to provide electricity to their community. She pioneered 21 community centers. These centers taught agriculture, health care, education, and spirituality. Although she was a profound leader and loved by many, her fate did not parallel her life's work. Sister Dorothy was brutally murdered on February 12th of this year after receiving several death threats from loggers and landowners. Knowing of this grave danger, Sister Dorothy wrote, "I don't want to flee, nor do I want to abandon the battle of these farmers who live without any protection in the forest. They have the sacrosanct right to aspire to a better life on land where they can live and work with dignity while respecting the environment." She then went on to say, "I am grateful to Notre Dame for not asking me to leave. This shows we are aware of the needs of the poor. The sisters have said they are worried about my safety. It is not my safety, but that of the people, which matters." At the time of her death, Sister Dorothy had just traveled to drop off clothes and food to families whose homes have been burned by ranchers and loggers. She was approached by 2 gunmen, and knowing her fate, reached into her cloth bag, took out her Bible, and began reading the Beatitudes. "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God." Sister Dorothy Stang is a true martyr. She lived and died teaching and fighting for peace and justice among a people who were poor and disenfranchised. She lifted up the oppressed and taught people about their rights as human beings. She was named Woman of the Year by the state of Pará for her work in the Amazon, and in 2004 she received the Humanitarian of the Year award from the Brazilian Bar Association for her work in the region. Sister Dorothy's dream was to have an area of land set aside by the federal government of Brazil as a federal reserve where the poor families and landless peasants would be safe, where they could farm their land, build their own income-producing businesses, and above all, where they could live in peace and dignity without threats to their lives. Sister Dorothy reminds us all to be courageous and to work for what we believe in. We must all be champions of our principles and causes, and that our religion is not merely a set of beliefs, but a series of actions. She gave her life to protect the downtrodden and forgotten. And while her brutal murder shows the great challenges we face in the pursuit of social justice, her life shows the awesome power one human being has to change the world. I hope that this simple act of commemoration will not be the end of Sister Stang's story, but the very beginning. That Congress will use this opportunity to demonstrate its concerns for inequality and poverty all over the world, by making available the resources needed to combat these social ills. And finally, Mr. Speaker, President Kennedy once said in a speech at Amherst College honoring Robert Frost that a nation reveals itself not only by the men it produces, but also by the men it honors, the men it remembers. Today we honor a fearless, selfless defender of peace, a champion in sustainable development, a person affectionately known as Irma Dorci, an angel of the Amazon, a brave martyr, Sister Dorothy Stang.
Yes, Sister Dorothy did all that and more. She worked for more than 40 years in the Amazon region of Brazil, serving the needs of people who were devastatingly poor. She fought to preserve the Amazon forest from mass destruction. So Sister Dorothy Stang has shown the world what it means to be a hero of social justice and a hero of environmental protection. Although Sister Dorothy accomplished extraordinary things, she was actually a very ordinary person, born in Dayton, Ohio, one of 9 children.
I think it's important that people know that Dot was a very active, happy young girl, and that she was very dedicated to whatever she did, and was one who would get into some kind of trouble if she really felt she wanted to. She had a lot of friends, yes, and she loved sports, she loved dancing, she loved to go out, she loved to be with friends. Very outgoing and a happy person.
In the mornings when we would get ready for school, I was her job. I don't know who were the boys' job, Mary, whoever, but I was her job. She had to make sure my face was clean and my hair was brushed and my clothes were tidy, and off to school we went to get there on time, because there were, let's see, the twin girls were 3 years older than me, then myself, and then the twin boys. So all of us within 5 years. And for my mom to be able to see to all of that, plus have our breakfast and book bags and all those kind of things, so we were sort of delegated out. And I was Dorothy's challenge, because I didn't like my hair brushed, and I was a brat. And that was her job, was to get me to school with a clean face, no tears, my books, my clothes. And she was very kind. She was. I was a brat, and she was very kind. Any sport there was at school, she played it. She worked, she made bed pads for the Dominican Sisters of the Sick Poor. They made pads for the indigent people's beds, and that was an every Friday night thing. There was like a small Bible study group that she was in, and they prayed for the needs of the school and the kids and things like that. She was the head of Club Coyote, which is a Catholic young people's group in Dayton at the time, and they had dances and hay rides and things like that. And so she was on that board, or the president of that. I mean, and she worked at Good Sam in the pharmacy after school from 4 to 8. So I don't know how she did all that. I worked that job and did nothing but that job, you know.
At the age of 17, Dorothy joined the Sisters of Notre Dame. She wanted to give her life in service to God and the people of God.
Dot and I talked together every once in a while about entering the convent. And we both had decided that that's what we wanted to do. And when I told her at the end of my senior year that I was entering, she said to me, "You're not going to enter the Sisters of Notre Dame and leave me behind. I'm coming with you." And she did. She entered at the end of her junior year. I think she chose to enter the Sisters of Notre Dame because she saw it as a missionary congregation, as well as a teaching congregation. She wanted to be a missionary. She wanted to be a missionary in China, and she put that at the top of her application.
Dorothy could not go to China as a missionary. Instead, she was sent to Phoenix, Arizona, where she spent her weekdays teaching in the classroom and her weekends working with migrant farmers and their families. There, she was deeply touched by the injustices and the poverty which she saw. The migrants lived in shacks without plumbing. They shared a common supply of water and common bathrooms. Disease was rampant. Since whole families worked in the fields, they suffered from the pesticides being sprayed by low-flying planes. Dorothy's dedication to the poor grew during this time of her life, so she was delighted when she was sent to Brazil to work with poor farmers and their families. Brazil is made up of a diverse population of indigenous people, Indians, persons of African descent, and descendants of the early Portuguese settlers. Dorothy and 3 other sisters were sent to the village of Carota in northeast Brazil. In the beginning, the work of the sisters was to teach the faith and to prepare people for the sacraments.
I think the first thing that we really came to understand was the oppression of the people, the poverty of the people, and the attitude of the people that I'm no good. I'm in this situation because that's what God wants. And so we began to say to the people, God doesn't want you poor. God doesn't want you to live in the circumstances that you're living in. You are a child of God. One of the first things we did when we went to Carota was to divide up the city, and we visited every house in the city, every family in the city. Then it was the dry time of the year. So we did street preaching, and we would walk down the street with lanterns and singing hymns, and then stop on a street corner. The priest would read a part of the Bible and give a little homily explaining the Bible. Now, mostly women and children would stand around, but there would always be men on the sidelines. And we would find out who these men were and write their names down. And then when the rainy season came, the priests invited these men to come for a Bible study. They got so into the Bible and loved it that we found out that they were in the marketplace on a little stool teaching what they had learned the night before. Those men became the leaders in their neighborhoods. And they began to have meetings, and we would go to those meetings, and they would begin to have Bible study in their neighborhoods, so that we were building up a leadership program, and then we would bring them in for leadership training. In the meantime, we were going into what we call the interior, the villages in the forest, and we would go to the home of the landowner, and all the people would come in, and we would have Mass. We would baptize anybody who had been born that year. We would marry anyone who started to live together that year. And I know the first time that we went in, Dorothy and I came home, and we cried over the situation, because they were like cattle that didn't know what was going on. They were just bunched together. After a year of that, we told the people that we would not go to their village anymore unless they invited us. And we would stay at their house and not the house of the landowner. This was difficult for them because they didn't think they were worthy to have the priests and the sisters there. The landowners began to get angry with us at this time because we were not staying with them anymore. They had no power over us. Again, we asked some of the men, and we concentrated on the men at first because they never went to church, and we wanted to get them involved. We did leadership training with the men, and then they went back and they started their basic Christian communities, and we helped them with that. The women loved it. They themselves, which we didn't realize, had felt left out. So they were really happy when we began to give leadership training to the women and do Bible studies with them. And what happened then was it became more of a community where men and women both took the responsibility. There were a few men who owned land, and all of the people worked for them. They farmed, and they had to buy their seed from the landowner, which he sold at a high price. They planted their crops. They had to buy from the landowner's store, and the coffee and the milk and the things they bought from the landowner's store was at a high price, so that they always owed the landowner. When the crops were ready, they had to sell them to the landowner at a low price. So they were like slaves, actually. They had no land of their own.
In 1972, a radical change took place. The Brazil government offered the landless farmers plots of land in the Amazon forest. Many responded to this offer. It gave them hope of a future for their families. Dorothy and another sister went with the families into the Amazon forest in the state of Para.
In 1972, the national government started the land reform movement. And at that point, they had built the Trans-Amazon Highway, which is still today a dirt road, except for 100 kilometers. They wanted to populate that area, and they offered land to anyone who wanted to go up there and settle that land. They would have their own plot of land. They could plant their own crops. This was like a dream for the people in Coroatá and other places. So they began to move up to the Amazon area.
De longe, eu sou do sertão. Sou Pedro, sou Paulo, Maria e João. Eu sou brasileiro, mas sou estrangeiro. Lutei pela pátria e ganhei cativeiro. Eu sou a nação. Eu também sou irmã. Sou povo de Deus e não tenho porção. Eu venho da fome, da seca e da dor. Eu sou do trabalho e não tenho valor. E agora me digam se eu tenho direito, se sou cidadão, ou por Deus não fui feito. E agora me digam se eu...
It was an exciting time. These people had never owned their own land. They did not know how to farm in the forest. However, with Dorothy's help, they learned sustainable farming and began to build their simple huts and to grow crops. They gathered in faith communities and learned of their dignity as human beings made in the image and likeness of God. Rather than allow themselves to be victims of injustice, they learned how to make their voices heard. They formed a farmers' union and often staged protests to demand their rights.
For a while, she lived with a family there. And then she built a little house, and she moved into the house. She built a school and started classes for the people there, brought in teachers. She built a chapel, all this with the people in the area, and they began to form a small community. She worked there for quite a while. It was during that time, in 1982, that the people began to see that they were being invaded constantly by ranchers who were coming into the area, also to take advantage of the Trans-Amazon Highway. And they would invade the people's property and chase them off the land. The people were trying to get help from the government, and they wouldn't pay any attention to them. So in 1982, they formed a union, and they called it the Farmers Unit of Trans-Amazonic East. The first thing they did was have a strike, because they had been asking the government to fix the roads, and the government wouldn't do it. So they struck, and they stayed on the road so no trucks or anything could get through. And after a couple days, the government gave in, and they came and they fixed the bridge and they fixed the road. And that was their first great success, and it made them feel really good. They started because they realized that if they worked alone, they would get nowhere. But together they would have more strength, that their voice would be heard a little bit more seriously as a group. They planted a common area so that people, if they needed food other than what they planted, it was a common farm area. They bought together a rice machine so that they could clean the rice and bag it and sell it. They also had a corn machine that they could do the same thing with. They built a big well where they would have clean water in the area. This is all in Nazaré. And they managed to get a truck donated to them. And they worked together to get their bags of rice and beans on that truck and get it into the city where they could sell. That's when the women started their little store. So it was a way of working together to better their lives.
That started and developed this whole, the school, the teachers, there was a building for adult education, the farmers were there, the women were there, health care, the education for the kids, the farming. They took me to this little mud building that was on Nazaré, and they took me in there and they said, we always felt she was coming back because she always left something in every one of her houses telling us that she's going to return. I go into this mud house, I'm looking on this wall, and on the wall was the picture of my daughters.
Dorothy loved these people who were working so hard to build a new life in the forest. She called them my people. She was one with them. She also learned to love the majestic Amazon forest. She realized that the forest held 2/3 of the world's biodiversity, plants, insects, birds, and animals, which had been evolving for eons in the richness of the rainforest. She knew that the Amazon drank in much of the poisonous carbon dioxide produced by the developed nations and breathed out oxygen which fed the lungs of people thousands of miles away. She was totally dedicated to the welfare of her people and to the conservation of the gift of the forest.
The local government people were always trying to destroy any project that would open up the economic field in the Amazon to more people, because basically the local politicians, they want slaves. They want to hold that economic progress to themselves only, and therefore leave the poor as slavery people. But she sensed this spiritual energy all around her, so she drew this picture of spirit beings jumping all around all around the trees, and then she had, you know, little mementos in every one of these houses that I went into of things that were very personal to her. And so they you know, they were saying, look at this, and where is she? There was an old man, you know, with a straw hat on, and you know, a wet t-shirt. Everybody's wet because it's just, you know, just wet there. And he grabs me, he says, come across the road. So he took me across the road, and of course CNN was there, and these other people. And I went across the road, and he said, well, she may have lived in this house afterwards, but here's another house that she lived in. And so he showed me the little room that she lived in with him and his family. And of course it had Dot's things were in that house too. And then he showed me around the house that he owned, and he said, and see this fruit tree? Dot told me how to plant that fruit tree. And you see this these potatoes, and you see these beans. Dot showed me how to do that. And then he said, and I'm going to take you over to a very special place. And he said, he whispered something in the Becky's ears, and all of a sudden everybody disappeared. And he didn't want anybody else to know about this special place that belonged to Dot. And at the bottom of this piece of land was this lake, little lake, and of course there were fish in there. And he said, you know, Dot was always telling me I need to put fish in that little pond. And he said, and I'm going to show you this little river that comes down in this pond. And he showed me, he's looking around like this. And he said, Becky, you're okay. And he said, see that rock right around the bend there? And I said, yes. And he said, that's where Dot, when she was finished during the day, she would sit on that rock with her books, and then she'd jump into the river and freshen herself up, and she'd sit on that rock and just let the sun bathe on her. And David, she was just absolutely into the environment, the earth.
But soon Dorothy and her people had to face a new evil, the greed of large soy and cattle farmers and illegal loggers who were eager to profit from the global market. The forest was being destroyed. Already 20% was due to the cutting and burning of the trees and plants. The land of the small farmers and their homes were being violently taken by large corporate farmers and ranchers. Houses and crops were burned, and the people driven deeper into the forest, where they were homeless until they could build once again. Then the whole destructive cycle would begin again, when those with money and power came deeper into the forest looking for more land. Government officials were bribed so that those who stood in the way of the land sharks were murdered. Between 1985 and 2005, more than 500 people were murdered over land disputes, and fewer than 10 murderers were jailed. It was a situation of lawlessness and violence.
They needed to work together because it gave them courage and it gave them force. When they were working by themselves and the ranchers would come in and try to take over their land, they were on their own and their land was taken. In that film, there's a woman who explains that they were being threatened. Their crops were being threatened. The ranchers were going to plant cattle grass where their crops were, and that as a group, they were going to go out and they were going to guard that land where they had planted their crops. If they had not had the union, if they had not learned to work together, then one person would have gone out there and it wouldn't have done any good. But a group of them going out, they saved the land. Ranchers and loggers, illegal ranchers and loggers, were moving into the area, and they would just take over the land that the people had, and the people would move farther and farther into the forest. Dot moved 6 times with them, and finally she moved to Anapu. Anapu is a town, but in the interior there were little groups of people that had land, and they were being invaded. And she began to work with them again to form basic Christian communities, the Farmers Union. She did much the same as what she did in Nazaré. She had also become a member of the Pastoral Land Commission, which is the arm of the bishops' conference that gives support to farmers. And she began to fight for the rights of the poor peasant farmers. And Sister Dorothy was teaching the people how to do sustainable farming. And the government would give a plot of land to a farmer on condition that that farmer would farm the land but not destroy the forest. And there were big tracts of land that were set aside for that. And Sister Dorothy was the person who was dividing that land up for the government to give to the people. Again, this made her an enemy of the ranchers and the loggers because they wanted to come in and take over that land.
Dot always believed that if she could just tell her story, that she could change anyone. And so she would hug this very resistant group of political people and rich people. She would hug them and try to transform and change their minds and get them to think about opening up the market to the poor. The politicians in the Amazon, in Anapu area, they really want to control any economic future, anything that has to do with the poor coming up. And Dot had an enormous sense of that. And so she absolutely wanted the poor to develop.
Yeah.
Dot was always saying to me, David, I don't understand. 1 minute they're telling me they're with me, and the next minute I'm finding out that they're not. And she said that she had always asked the police for assistance, for help. She always had that little satchel on the side of her waist that was filled with documentation showing whose house had been burnt down, who had been put in jail, the public lands being misappropriated, or land grabbers taking this plot or that section of land. She had all that information in her satchel. And when she would talk with the politicians or the mayor or the police, she would constantly pull these documents out. And she would show them and say, on this date, at this time, this happened, and why aren't you doing something about it? And she didn't stop there, though. She felt that she had the responsibility to educate them first, and then she'd get on the bus and have a 13-hour ride on the bus to Belang, and she'd go up the ladder. She'd talk to the federal prosecutor, Felicio Pontes. She would talk with the state police. She would pull again these documents out. Now, you know, I have talked to the mayor, I've talked to the local policeman, and now I'm talking to you, and this person, and this person, and this person. And what was so mind-blowing about that was when we went in December before her murder, she was on television. And she was on this program called Sin Censura, Without Censure. And she was sitting there, and Maggie and I were watching the television. She was very quiet, and they had other people that were on the program also. And so the television, the MC was focusing on these other people first, and then they went, to the 73-year-old woman, and they said, "And why are you here today?" It was almost kind of like, and Dorothy, in a very quiet voice, would start off saying, "Well, I live in Anapu, and the people in Anapu are being murdered. These Brazilians are being murdered." And she started naming names. Then she started pulling out these documents and all this government information on it, all this personal information. This person like Taladao or this person Bida, they have done this and this and this, and nobody's doing anything about it. And I've talked to the local policeman, I've talked to the mayor, and all of a sudden all the cameras started coming over, and they were focusing on this very quiet woman, and wow. And then for the next half hour, 45 minutes, there they were, and mouths, you see their mouths opening. This woman was disclosing everything that was happening in the Amazon.
This was Dorothy's challenge, to stand with her people and to protect further destruction of the forest. She worked for the cause of the powerless, and so made enemies of the powerful. There was a price on her head. $17,500 was offered to anyone who would kill her.
And I think she was up to here.
Yes.
I think she realized nothing's happening. It's almost like the Jesus story with the Pharisees. All of a sudden, what other path is there but to just throw it all out there, and if I'm crucified, I'm crucified. And I think God had a great sense of that.
Sister Dorothy had been struggling against the loggers, the illegal, I want to stress illegal, the illegal loggers and ranchers who were taking over the land that had been given to the people by the government. And she became an enemy of the wealthy because she was trying to get the deeds, the written deeds for these little pieces of land that the people had. She had been asking for help from the police, and they had refused to give her help. About what was the end of January, when she again went to the police, told them that there was going to be trouble, and could they please protect the people, the peasant farmers. Again, they said no. She called me on February 2nd, and she told me this story, and she said there was violence. One of the men who worked for a rancher and had bought some land, part of the land that he was sold without him knowing it was part of the PDS. It was part of the Sustainable Development Program. And there was a man named Luis who belonged to the community in Boa Esperanza. He and his wife, his 6 children, his mother, his niece, and her 2 children were living in this house, primitive house, in Boa Esperanza. And Tatu, who had bought that land, surrounded his house, and for several days they were harassing him, Luis, constantly. And Tatu finally said, "If you're not out of the house, you're going to be in trouble." Luis said, "This is my house, I'm not leaving." And Tatu said, "If you are not out by morning, I'm going to line your family up, and I'm going to shoot them one by one until I get to you." Well, Luis knew that that's what they would do, and so he gathered his family up, and they left the house. Tatu and his men came back, and Louise and his family from the forest watched them pour gasoline around the house and burn it down and then ruin his crops. On February 2nd, when Dot called, she told me this. And she said, I told the police this was going to happen, and they didn't pay any attention to us. She said, I'm going to go in and see what we can do to bring that community back together again. On the 11th of February in 2005, she went in to Boa Esperanza. She took food, she took clothing for Louise's family. She had a quick meeting with some of the people, and while she was there, they were going to have a meeting the next morning. While she was there, some of the people told her that there were two men walking around saying they were going to kill her. She found them, and she sat down on a log with them, and again, she tried to explain. She got her maps out, put them down on the ground, tried to explain to them that the land belonged to the Sustainable Development Program. They said to her, we're going to kill you, and we're going to build Bida's house, who is one of the ranchers, on top of your dead body. Haifran, who was one of the assassins, said to her, or said that she asked them to come to the meeting the next morning. She shook their hands and she blessed them, and she went off to the house of a farmer there to sleep that night. She was in Francisco's house, sleeping. She was not in her hammock. She was sleeping on the ground. It evidently was a dark night. It was raining. Haifran and his partner, Clodoaldo, went to the house, intending to kill her that night. But they couldn't find her. They didn't know that she was on the floor sleeping. So they went back to wherever they were staying. The morning of the 12th, Sister Dorothy got up. She started down the road to the meeting about 7 o'clock in the morning. Along the way, she passed the house of one of the farmers, whose name is Cicero, and she called out to him and said, are you coming to the meeting? And he said, yes, I'll be right behind you. So she kept walking, and he was a little bit behind her. As she went up a hill and rounded the bend, Clodoaldo and Haifran stepped out in front of her. They began to argue with her again, and were told that she got her maps out again and showed it to them. And after they talked for a while, it seems she turned away, and Haifran called her name, and she turned back, and he was pointing a revolver at her. She reached in the little bag she was carrying, and she pulled out her Bible, and she said, this is my weapon. And she opened it and she began to read the Beatitudes. And they listened. And when she got to, blessed are the peacemakers, they will be called the children of God, Haifran shot her 3 times. And when she fell, he stood over her and shot her 3 times again in the back of the head. Cicero, who was behind her, ran for help and ran to save his own life. The 2 assassins ran into the forest, and they told us that they ran to Bida's ranch, and they stayed there until it got dark that night.
And that last time she came, it's an interesting because she came back that summer. Yes. And I'm in Chicago, so I called her and talked to her, and she said, well, I'm only going to be there for a couple of days after the Namur pilgrimage before she went back. And I said, I'm coming down. So I did come down, and she was trying to get the judge in Brazil and all kinds of things. I was just standing here waiting for a moment when I could talk to her practically. And we went out for ice cream the night before she left. And so we had but I look back later and I think, what if I hadn't decided to go down that summer? And then we met Liz and she was going out of the property as we were coming home and, talking about, and Dorothy said, something about, well, they don't kill people who have degrees or something.
I was afraid she'd end up in a Brazilian jail.
Right.
She said,
no, they won't.
She said, I'll have a ministry in jail.
Yeah.
This would be a terrible story if it were not Christian, because we have the story of Jesus. We believe in resurrection and life through death.
The news went out in the media all over the world. And I believe that's what forced the president to act. Within 24 hours, he had sent 2,000 troops into the area to keep peace. He had set aside a larger reserve for the PDS movement. He had called the reserve the Dorothy Stang Reserve, and of course made all kinds of promises about the freedom of the poor there to work the land, which have never been kept. While that was going on, outside the building where the autopsy was taking place, there were hundreds of people who were standing there and having a vigil. Then, when her body was released, they carried her to the parish church where the sisters live. And I believe they said it was around 11 o'clock when they got there with the body. There were hundreds, close to 1,000 people there. And they kept vigil all night. The bishop had been traveling, and he came right straight there in his blue jeans and his travel clothes. And he told the people that he would have Mass at 4 o'clock in the morning and invited people to come to it. And the church was packed. They had all kinds of banners. Everyone was shocked. Everyone was extremely upset about her. They saw her immediately as a martyr. The bishop said Mass at 4:30 in the morning. Then she was carried to the airport, taken to Altamira, which is the diocesan seat in the Xingu Diocese. People, again, hundreds, met the airplane at the airport in Altamira, and they processed to the church in Altamira, where they had another wake and a Mass, and hundreds of people were there. Then she was taken by truck to Anapu, where she wanted to be buried. And again, hundreds of people walked in procession. They met the truck. They took Dot's body to the place of her burial, which was in the forest in San Rafael Center. They had a big Mass there also. The sadness, the grief of the people was just very penetrating.
She just stood in the gap. She carried their land certificates and titles right with her, and she proved to them that they were a person and that this was their property, and that the fake land titles that people made had no meaning, that she had them, this was their property. And they knew that she would go to the police when someone was murdered, and they knew she would go to the mayor, and they knew she was there for them. There wasn't anybody going to walk over her, you know, and they trusted her for that. And I think that's why she was so darn determined when people would be murdered, and that it was like she let them down, and so she had to go make it right.
So this is Sister Dorothy's story. But what does it mean to us? How are we changed because of her life and death?
I think that what Dot would want those of us who are in the world to know and to live is, first of all, to realize that we are all children of God, and that all of us have a right to live in dignity as human beings. We have a right to have enough food to eat. We have a right to have a decent home. We have a right to an education. And that not only do human beings have rights, but the whole of nature is part of God's creation. And that from the time that human beings were created, God told us to take care of the earth. She loved creation. She loved the animals. She loved the birds. She loved the everything that God had made. And her message to us is we must take care of it so that future generations can enjoy the earth and the beauty that God has put into the earth for us.
You know, I think it's interesting that in her death, she has touched a lot of people, and her people have become a lot larger than just those she touched in life.
I think in the real sense of the word, a martyr. And you look at, you know, all the old martyrs, you know, that by their lives, we can take example, and by her life, we can look and see what we can do to help poor, whether it's the poor where I am in Phoenix or Boston or Chicago or wherever we are. We can use that, I think, as a martyr, as a true martyr. You know, she was here in Cincinnati once, and we were walking along, and we were down at St. Peter and Paul, and she was watching the kids play, and you know how little kids play. They put their little hearts and souls in their play, and she said, the children in Brazil don't play like that. She said they don't have enough food, they don't have the energy to do that, and it just struck me so much. And what her message is for the poor, is for the poor. And of course that's Julie's message too, you know, is the poor.
I think her death was like a trumpet call for the what's happening to the world resources, because you know, like it's like David and Goliath. You know, she's David. And with her death, it was like the slingshot, because I think what happens is her death was rang throughout the whole world of what's happening down there, with the big multinationals taking all the thing out and destroying the rainforest. But that's happening in many countries. So I think in that sense, her death was prophetic, because I think, and I like what Marins said, another Brazilian here, that small people doing small things in small places do great things. And I think that is what Dot did. You know, her death really is a call to save the world from people who would destroy the planet. So to me, that has really impacted my own life too.
this is the part of the world where there's so much new life, and even for us here it's so inspiring, and it's such an example of what it means to give your one and only life, and each day, the call to me and to all of us to give our one and only life, and how inspiring that is for the young people in our world today, because this is something they're like, wow. The people who have been at conferences with young people, they were saying that, Dorothy Stang everyone's around the Sisters of Notre Dame booth now because there are pictures of Dorothy Stang, and this has just lit a fire underneath young people who are looking for ways to give their life to God and to God's people and to do goodness in this world. And I'm excited about what that might mean as we continue to kind of cross borders in terms of life in Notre Dame and just really just life. I think that she's an incredible example of what that means.
People knew about Mother Teresa because she was doing it before she died. But Dorothy Stang was doing it for probably longer than Mother Teresa was, almost. But no one knew about her. And that was her whole life. She went about doing what she was doing, didn't make any fanfare, no one knew about it, but she was very passionate about it and very devoted to it. And maybe if we can't do the same thing, because as I said, I never really had the desire to do it, to take her place, that we can still use that whole sense of, going about and doing something differently maybe for the poor, for social justice, but in the way she did it, which was not that anybody knew about it until after she was dead.
I think that's the very message that the president of the University of Dayton gave not only on February 2nd when he presented the degree for Dot, but also my sister and niece and nephew told me that at this year's graduation for the University of Dayton, the president again spoke about Dot Stang. So the message is going all around, and we don't know all the people that are touched by her love. But wonderful things will be done because of her sharing her love.
What struck me about her life, when you read about the account leading up to her assassination or her death, was she never hated her enemies.
No.
She talked to those two people and tried to convince them and love them. I just think that wasn't a bad bone in her body.
No.
She just loved everybody. Just amazing.
The life of Sister Dorothy Stang gives us courage. If this friendly, happy, fun-loving, prayerful person, if this ordinary Christian could spend a lifetime reverencing and loving the God-given dignity of people who were so different from her, then we can do the same. We can open our hearts to our brothers and sisters in this global society in which we live. We too can recognize the injustices of global greed and reach out to build a more just world.
She was an everyday person. She didn't go be a saint. Even though she has, as far as I'm concerned. But she was just that steady Freddy, just every day there, every day concerned, and to do whatever. Just like standing in between the gap for me, between my mom and me and my dad and me, or older brothers and me, she would stand in that gap. And that's what she did for all those people.
This one's incredible. You're talking about the issues of rich and poor. I'm sitting in the sister's house there in Anapu, and it's in April, and it's raining outside and it's dark. And of course the sisters always have the doors open because people are always coming in and out. And all of a sudden this big man comes lumbering, literally lumbering into the house, and his eyes are bulging, And I believe it was Sister Jane was there. And she looks at me, she says, I don't know where he is. And he comes in and he says in Portuguese, where's Dorothy's brother? And of course he all of a sudden turns to me and he realizes that that's me. And he comes quickly over to me and gives me a hug. And of course everybody's like this because they don't know who he is or what he's going to do. And he gives me a big hug. And he sits down and he just looks at me. And he's touching me like this. And he says, I've got to tell you about your sister. And Jane is translating for me. And he says, you need to know that a month before your sister was murdered, my brother was murdered. And I need to tell you that story. And he says, my brother was driving on the road in Anapu, and his car was full of things. And he was set upon by thieves. They stopped his car, pulled him out of his car, and was beating the living daylights out of him. And there was another car behind my brother's car. And the person in that car jumps out of the car, runs up to my brother, chases the thieves away, he said. Grabs my brother, puts him in her car, and tells some other people that were with her to guard that car, and takes him to the hospital, in a local clinic, and stays with him until he dies. And he says, you need to know that was your sister. And he says, and you need to know that I'm a Seventh-day Adventist, and I was taught not to like Catholics. And I was taught by the mayor and all the government city council people, because I'm on that council, that Dorothy was a witch and to hate her. And he says, and his eyes get like this and his mouth is just wide open. He says, what do I believe now? What do I do? I mean, that's a Bible story.
Yes.
What do I do? I don't know what to believe now, he said. And he gives me a big hug, and he cries, and he runs out of the building. What courage it must have taken for him to even come into that, into the house. What courage that must have. And he said, as he's leaving, she was invited into every one of our houses. I have other brothers and sisters that own businesses in Anapu. We all don't know what to think now. And she was invited for that 30 days that she lived to come into any one of our shops, and she could have had anything. I think Dorothy's impact is that we must live simply. We must live with the poor, and if we understand the simplicity and this issue of poverty, then we will know how to act on this earth. And I think Dot was very clear about that. She dressed simply. She had a little backpack on the back of her body when she traveled. She was a very simple person, and yet she was so rich because she was free to see the God-given gifts that we have on this earth. She saw it, and she wanted to give that to everybody. And because she wasn't so controlled with things, I think that's what she has to give, is that we must free ourselves from being controlled with things. The greatest gifts are free. And I think that's her message.
Sister Dorothy's life and death have made a difference. We too can make a difference. May her life and death expand our hearts so that we too can find ways to bring forth the fruit of justice and hope for all people. May God give us hearts as wide as the world.